Hey, I'm Jeff from Full Race, and today we're going to show you how to install a Full Race Formline Turbo Kit on a Gen 2 Raptor F-150 EcoBoost. And it's a daunting task, so watch this video. By the end, you're going to see that it is absolutely doable. And while most people will use the factory procedure to install R&R turbos, it's okay. It's just you're going to miss a few best practices, tips and tricks along the way that are going to really improve your reliability for the long haul. We're going to apply anti-seize to every threaded surface. We're going to use silicone lubricant on every O-ring. We're going to replace all the risky parts that really do need to be replaced on this engine. And we're going to make it as easy as possible for you. So stick with us, and by the end, you'll see that you can absolutely succeed at this project. All right, we're going to get started, and I think it's really important to start this installation on the workbench before we tear into the truck. It's really important to realize that this truck is twin turbos, and the left-hand side, driver's side, which we have right here, is really a mirror image of the right-hand drive, passenger side. And what I like to do is keep all the hard lines separate to avoid any mix-up, and it can be confusing because a lot of this stuff looks the same, so what we're going to do real quickly is explain what the different sides are. So we'll start on the right side, passenger side. Garrett ships this turbo with a very large, oversized compressor inlet, and it's for a reason. This thing needs to breathe. But if you're in California, or if you're using stock inlets, which we really don't recommend, Garrett does include a stock inlet, OEM size inlet adapter. This is necessary for your carb EO, and if you're in another state that doesn't apply to carb and you're looking to make some power, you're going to want to keep these on it. So again, you shouldn't need to use these, but if you're in California or stock intakes, you will have to. The next thing we're going to look at is the downpipe adapter. So if you're using a aftermarket or a stock OEM style downpipe, which has this kind of ball flange, bell flange on it, you're going to need the Full Race downpipe adapter. And the reason is this contour on the inside is an exact fit to the very large Garrett contour. And I don't know if you can see this, but this is an absolute textbook fit. Any other downpipe adapter is going to be quite a bit smaller on the inside, so there's going to be a lip from the exhaust flowing, hit this lip, and then creates turbulence in the downpipes. We'll use anti-seize supplied. Got to use anti-seize on the turbine housing hardware. Your future self will thank you when you go to remove these in the future. And we'll thread these in. These are Inconel from Ford, very high quality studs, and then corresponding Inconel nuts. You can tell it's Inconel because it's non-magnetic, so super high quality. And stock downpipes or most aftermarket downpipes, you're going to need the Full Race adapter. Next, we're going to look at the oil feed lines. And I think it's really important to note that whenever I start a project like this, I always like to use a little bit of caution and apply some masking tape to the oil inlet. Super important that you do not get any contaminants or debris in the oil feed inlet. And so a little bit of masking tape now will save you a whole lot of aggravation later. The oil feed line needs to be replaced. Anytime you replace a turbocharger, you need to replace the oil feed line. But just as important, or maybe more important, is the oil feed filter. And these tend to gum up with debris over time. And this truck has had some miles on it. I'm not sure what it's going to look like when we pull the oil feed filter out. We'll show it to you in a little while, but it is absolutely imperative that you replace the oil feed filter and the oil feed line together. Failure to do so could result in Garrett voiding your warranty if debris or contaminants enter the bearing housing. So it's of the utmost importance that you keep your oil system clean. And for that reason, we actually took these out of the bags for this install. I recommend keeping this and the feed in a bag the entire time until you're absolutely ready to put them in the truck. You'll see that there's a blue cap. This is a left-hand thread cap, so don't go crazy trying to remove it. You actually have to go righty-loosey to get this thing out, so just to be prepared. The oil drain, this is the driver's side oil drain. You'll note that it has 3 bends in it, one at the top, one in the middle, and one at the end. And it's important that you don't mix this up because it kind of looks like the passenger side oil drain, which has only 2 bends in it. And the real differentiating factor here is the passenger side has a much longer straight section in order to clear the starter. So we're definitely going to want to keep these things separated. And at this point, we can now move on to one of our favorite products, the coolant lines. And this is a Full Race coolant line set. These are kind of known as the biggest issue with these trucks because guaranteed, if you have an F-150 EcoBoost from 2011 to current, you're probably going to have an antifreeze leak, coolant leak from the turbocharger at some point. So I don't know what Ford was thinking. I love the trucks, I love the engines, but these coolant lines leave a lot to be desired. What we have here, it's a fully TIG welded stainless steel coolant line, hard line, with a silicone end and a AN fitting that goes right into the head. And so these are a little bit tricky. We'll get into these later on, but if you really want to make your install reliable and bulletproof, this is a critical component. Next, we'll move on to the manifolds. These include a replacement donut gasket, which will go in here. Inconel studs for both the turbo side and the manifold side. The nuts, also a high-end stainless steel, not mild steel like the factory. And then moving on to this side, it's really the same thing. You'll just notice that the oil feed filters are a little bit shorter on the right-hand side, the left-hand side. It just goes into the block a little bit less. So simple way to differentiate them. The oil feeds, similar configuration, but again, it's a different fitment from the left to the right. We include a little packet of anti-seize and silicone lubricant, and I highly recommend using this. So the anti-seize goes for every threaded surface, and the silicone lubricant goes for every O-ring surface. So it's really important that you take the time, use this anti-seize, especially anything that threads into the turbine housing. So in the case of these downpipe adapters, got to use the anti-seize. It'll save you a lot of time and probably some skin on your knuckles trying to crack stuff loose way in the future. All right, now we're going to start setting the turbos up for the install. So we'll start with the passenger side, right-hand side turbo. And I like to start with the oil drain first. Apply a little bit of silicone lubricant to the turbo side drain flange. And the way you can tell the turbo side from the engine side, the engine side tab is quite a bit larger. So we'll start with the small side, turbo side, apply a little bit of silicone lubricant to it, and then make sure that O-ring seats without any friction. Should pop right into place. Next, we're going to look at the coolant lines. I will be showing you the full race coolant feed line and return line. And you want to think about your coolant lines as the cool water comes in the bottom and the hot water leaves out the top. And the reason is there's a phenomenon called thermal siphoning, which causes heat to rise. And so the cold water coming in gets heated up by the turbocharger, and it will naturally cool the turbo off. So feed in the bottom, drain out the top, or return I should call, supply in the bottom, return out the top. So at this point, I like to leave the feed disconnected, the oil feed disconnected, but we have in place our oil drain, coolant feed, coolant return, and then these little AN fittings are going to go into the motor a little bit later. One's for the block, one's for the head. Move on to the driver's side. This is the left-hand side turbocharger. But we're going to do the same exact thing. Tabs, big one on the engine side, small one on the turbo side. A little bit of silicone lubricant on the O-ring. Pop that in the drain hole. We'll take the short coolant feed. Put that in the bottom. Get the coolant return on the top. And you'll note that the coolant return is the only line that does not have a barb fitting at the end of it. And you'll see why in just a few minutes. Makes the install much easier to address that later. All right, and so again, oil feed and oil feed filter, we're going to save them for later. This turbo has now got an oil drain, coolant feed, coolant drain. The AN fittings we'll save for later. Next thing we're going to talk about is the manifold hardware. So this is your turbocharger to manifold gasket. It needs to be pressed into this groove kind of firmly, and you want to have about half of it exposed. Carefully tap that into place. Next thing we'll look at is the turbo manifold hardware. And so the OEM hardware must be discarded after it's used, after it's loosened. It's a mild steel hardware solution, which really isn't up to the temperatures that a gasoline turbocharger like this sees. So we actually switch out to an Inconel stud with anti-rotation threads, and it uses an E7 inverted Torx head. So overall, it's a higher quality stud. It does not need to be replaced after you service or remove manifold, so this is going to outlast your engine. and then a corresponding nut. I still recommend using high temp anti-seize on the stud and the nut interface. It'll save a lot of effort later. But all in all, the turbos are ready, coolant lines are oriented, drain lines are oriented, feed lines are waiting to be put on the motor, and we'll pop these gaskets in and we'll see in a minute. So now that all the hard lines are installed, oil drains installed, let's just take a look at the coolant return tube. And you'll notice that the clamp, the V-band clamp that holds the turbine housing to the center section is very, very close. It's a little too close for comfort. And so real simply what we're gonna do is loosen this nut, rotate the clamp, and just give it a little bit more clearance. Corey parked the vehicle on the lift, set the e-brake, and now he's disconnecting the negative battery terminal using a 10mm socket. Next, Corey's going to remove the engine appearance cover. This is two 10mm sockets in the front and a rubbery clip in the back. From here, we're going to lift the truck up, pull the wheels off, and get ready to tear into things. All right, now we're going to move on to pulling the starter. This is going to provide access to remove the passenger side oil return tube from the block. You'll need a 10mm socket to remove the transmission cooler line, and then use a 13mm socket to remove the starter bolts and separate the starter from the transmission bell housing. Next, we're going to unplug both side electronic wastegates. Corey's going to use a pick tool. After that, we will loosen the clamps for both side turbo inlets and outlets from the charge pipe and the intake tubes. Corey's going to use this jack to lift the transmission up, put the load off of the transmission mount. He'll remove the driver's side rearmost skid plate, and then he'll be able to drop down the transmission mount and remove the downpipe. Now Corey's going to remove the intake airbox tubes. He's loosened all the clamps. He's going to extract that from the engine bay. Then he will separate the quick disconnect clips from the intake tubes on the driver's side fittings, carefully not to bend or break any of the plastic retaining clips. This way he can extract everything and pull it out of the engine bay. So these are the OEM intake tubes that Corey just pulled out, and you can see that these inlets are pretty small. This is going to match up with the little Garrett adapter that we're not really recommending using, but that's how it would work. And to put this in comparison, these are the inlets that we are using, so quite a bit bigger and really important if you're planning to do any more than 19 or 20 pounds of boost. This will choke up right around 19. Now drain the engine coolant and engine oil. Very important to allow the engine to fully cool before cracking open the cooling system. At this point, the coolant and the oil are drained out of the motor, so Corey's going to begin by removing the oil supply line from the left-hand driver's side turbo. We'll start with the oil supply line. It's at the block, a T45 torque socket with a 3-inch extension. We'll move over to the turbo. That's also the same T45 Torx with a 6-inch extension. And then we're going to look at the water supply line on the block side. And again, that's the same 6-inch extension T45 torque socket. After that, we can unbolt the oil drain hose from the engine block side of each tube. Some residual oil will leak out, but be careful to save the hardware. We're going to reuse that once we fasten the new turbos and new oil drain tubes. The hardest part after this is going to be accessing the driver's side coolant return from the back of the cylinder head. It's a really tight fit between the head and the firewall. The Ford procedure says to release the fuel tubes from the retainer clamp, but this isn't necessary. You can do it. It's quite a bit of work to get the retaining clamp off. We'll give you a little bit more room to work, but if you can fit your hands in, you can skip this step. At this point, get ready to remove the last 3 turbocharger to exhaust manifold bolt. These are using a T50 Torx socket, and they are tight. They've been through heat cycles, so this is definitely one that you're gonna have to use a little bit of muscle on a breaker bar to crack loose. At this point, the driver's side turbo and its hardware is completely removed. So Corey went ahead and is removing all of the exhaust manifold nuts so the exhaust manifold can come out of the engine bay, at which point we'll then remove all the exhaust manifold studs from the cylinder head. These studs and nuts are not reusable. They're mild steel. They should be thrown out, and we'll be replacing them with the full race Inconel studs. All right, so now the turbo's out, manifold's out, studs are out, and Corey is taking care of the last thing, which is going to be getting the original OEM oil feed filter out of the block. So this is a 25mm or 1-inch socket. It's located right behind the alternator. Can't really show you in there, but Corey's pulling the fitting out, and we're going to take a look and see how clogged up the screen is. It is not the worst. A little bit of gunk right there, but overall this isn't bad. Probably one of the better ones I've seen. Regardless, it's a really good idea to change this thing out. Some people might skip this to save time, but it can void your warranty on your turbocharger if debris gets in there or if you're restricting oil from getting in there. So definitely change this thing out. Now all the studs are removed, so Corey's going to take some compressed air, blast out any contaminants from inside of the threaded holes, and make sure that they are clean and clear for us to thread the new studs in place. We're going to use an E7 inverted torque socket on the head of the Inconel stud kit, and that's going to allow Corey a really nice purchase to be able to fully thread these in. There is a anti-rotation thread used, so if it feels a little rough, as long as you blast it out with clean air, it should be able to seat properly. Now he can install a fresh gasket. It's worth noting that stud number 8, the farthest lower rearmost location, we're gonna want to install that one after the gasket is on because it makes it a lot easier to put the gasket and clear the heat shield for the crankshaft position sensors. Now comes the fun part. Get to put the new full race Formline manifold in place. When it comes time to tighten the nuts down, torque the nuts down in 2 stages. Your first stage is 168 inch-pounds or 19 Newton meters. And your second stage, your final torque, is 18 foot-pounds or 25 Newton meters. Corey's gonna do the first step by hand and then 2 more from there. Now that we're about ready to install the driver's side turbocharger into the engine bay, it's a really good idea to focus on the heat shield. The wider volute of this compressor housing necessitates a little bit of a massaging, so you're gonna need to trim the heat shield right here. And also, when you're installing coolant lines, we really like to install with a little cut right about here, and this is gonna make your coolant line way easier. So a little Dremel or flap disc trim there, and then take a grinder or a pair of tin snips, whatever, and just cut this whole section off. This will make your whole install of the coolant line into the motor way easier. Now that we cut this lower section off of the heat shield, there's a lot more room there. We trimmed this with a grinder to give a little more space off the housing, and we're going to reinstall these screws into the bearing housing, into the compressor cover, using the 8mm socket. And it's going to be a lot easier to install with this little notch clearance stout. The last thing we'll do just before install is check this little bolt here for the heat shield. This tends to foul the manifold, so you can grind it down a little bit. And then the corner right next to it can also hit the manifold, so you can just tap it down, make a little clearance there, and that's enough. It's tight, but there's enough room here. Now we're gonna place the turbo on the engine in the truck with the coolant and oil drain hard lines already attached. The AN fittings and the heat shields are all fastened. The first thing I like to do is note that the coolant return hose is left open. We just installed the barb onto the head, and that's gonna slide on. So let's start by putting some silicone lube on the oil drain O-ring and bore. Lather that up so it slides in real nice. We're gonna do the same thing to the coolant supply O-ring. Get that all in place. And now we're gonna go pop that oil return into the block, kind of gentle. Pop it in place. And then do the same thing to the coolant supply. Pop that in place. So push down, kind of locks in. This is the reason why we cut the heat shield. It gives us so much more room. If I hadn't cut that heat shield, my fingers would not be able to fit too easily. So give yourself a little room there. Put the T45 into the oil drain. We'll tighten that up in a minute. And now we come to the back of the head where the coolant return hose is. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna actually push the hose onto the barb as the turbo gets sucked up into place. And then kind of sits all nice. We'll take turbo manifold hardware, install that. And the coolant and oil lines are really holding the turbo right in place as we fasten it to the manifold. So it's a really nice, kind of guides itself in procedure. These are T50s, so we're gonna wanna cinch them up, tighten everything down. And once that's all tight, we can move ahead, and there's a clamp on this coolant line where we'll clamp it and slide it up. This one doesn't have it, my bad. Hope you forgive me. At this point, it's a good idea to install the oil feed. But there's not a lot of room in here because your factory motor mount is right in there. So it's a good idea to actually kind of set the oil feed in first before you install the turbocharger. I realize I didn't do that here, but yeah, set the oil feed in, put the turbo up. We don't have a motor mount to hold it, so I couldn't really do that here. And then after the turbo's installed and cinched up, then we're gonna fasten with the T45s, the oil feed to the block, and then the oil feed to the turbo. Once you tighten the turbocharger screws to the manifold, you're gonna need to do that in 2 stages. Your first step is 20 Newton meters or 177 inch-pounds. Your second step is gonna be 32 Newton meters or 24 foot-pounds. This fully seats that little crush gasket that we put into the groove. All right, now we're gonna move on to the passenger side turbocharger. Corey is unbolting and disconnecting the oil supply from the center section. He's going to use a T45 torque socket on a 6-inch extension. This requires you to bend the oil supply hardline and kind of yank it out of the center section. Don't be gentle because it's going to be scrapped. This cannot be reused, and we're going to remove it from the block side, which is behind the air conditioning compressor later. Then he'll get the oil drain out, move to the rear of the head by the firewall, which is the coolant return, and then we'll get the coolant feed after that. For the rear of the cylinder head, Corey's going to use a 3-inch extension with a T45 socket, access the screw that holds the hard line into the back of the cylinder head. This thing's a little bit crusty. It has a lot of age and use on these old O-rings, so it might require a little bit of prying to get that thing out. Now, using a T50 torque socket, Corey's going to remove the 3 turbocharger to exhaust manifold bolts. Corey just battled these crusty T50 torque screws for about, I don't know, 5-10 minutes. Got the 3 turbochargers to exhaust manifold bolts out, and now it's going to allow him to remove the turbocharger and its lines. A little bit of coolant's going to spill out of the block, so hope you got a bucket lined up. Looks like Corey doesn't. Poor Corey. Look at that crusty turd. Now that the turbo's out, we can make a little more clearance around the AC compressor area. So we got to unbolt the AC compressor from the motor, and we're going to start by removing the AC stretch belt. The fastest and easiest way to get the belt off is by cutting it. So Corey's going to use a pair of cutters. Now we can unbolt the 3 screws from the compressor. That's a deep 10mm socket for the top and a shallow 10mm socket for the bottom. Now that the 3 10mm bolts are out of the AC compressor was separated from the engine, giving you access to the block coolant supply tube and oil supply tube fittings. So using a short 1.5-inch extension with a T45 torque socket, you're going to get the screw that holds the coolant supply fitting out of the block, and then you can pry the coolant supply hardline out of the block. Corey's going to actually move on to pulling the exhaust manifold studs and gaskets out and blast them with compressed air clean before pulling the oil feed filter off. And the reason is we don't want to risk any contaminants entering the engine. So while the filter's in place, finish up the whole exhaust side, get all that grimy stuff out, put that back together, then we'll worry about the oil feed filter. Now we're going to use the 5mm socket to extract the studs from the cylinder head. Some of the studs already self-extracted because they were crusty and stuck to the nuts. As Corey was taking the nuts out of the exhaust manifold, they kind of pulled themselves out of the head. So 3 less to do, but again, 5mm socket here, and then we'll blast the bores clean with compressed air. Now we are going to blast the oil feed filter area with brake clean. Try to get it clean, hit it with some compressed air and blast out any residuals. And we'll use a 21mm socket on a 1.5-inch little extension, stubby extension, to get that fitting out. We'll take a look and see how dirty it is. While Corey's doing that, I am going to just quickly take a little bit of silicone lubricant and apply it to the O-ring on the new fitting, and then we'll swap them and make sure no contaminants can get into the motor. You can see this one is definitely old, crusty, but overall still pretty clean, so previous owner kept up with oil changes. Now Corey's going to install it back in the bore and carefully tighten it with the 21mm socket on that same 1.5-inch extension. Now the exhaust manifold studs are fully installed using an E7 inverted torque socket. Corey's going to install the new gasket on top, and then we can install the Formline Turbo manifold. When it comes time to fitting the passenger side heat shield on, just be aware that if you have a 2017, it has the smallest turbos of the family, when you go to fit that heat shield, it's going to actually interfere right here. But if you have a 2018 heat shield, it does have larger turbos, and so it's going to be able to fit and clear that zone. It does rub a little bit, but there's clearance, everything lines up. So we're going to use a 2018 heat shield. Again, if you have a 17, that's fine. You can just notch it out. Use a 2018, we'll cut this off and fit it. Be right back. Now the heat shield's trimmed. Everything should fit, and then we're going to tighten these 3 8mm screws and get the heat shield in place. Now we're going to install the passenger side turbo, and we're going to start in the same way as the driver's side, just by putting the O-ring lube on the oil return. Both the bore and the O-ring need to get lathered up. Makes it a lot easier to install. And then we'll do it on the coolant supply and the coolant return. Once they're sufficiently lubed, you just kind of guide this oil return right into the bore, line it a little bit, and just pop it in. And then we'll do the same thing with the coolant feed. Line that one up with the T45 hole there. Now, as we push the turbo up into place, you'll see on the back of the motor, the coolant return goes into this little bung. So we have the O-ring lube on it. It should just pop into place too, pretty nice. And then we can put the T45 Torx on it. And all these are really serving to hold the turbo in place up against the manifold. Next, we will install the oil feed to the turbo and the block, and we're not going to tighten the turbo to the manifold until the very end. This kind of lets the turbo float and move around, giving the system flexibility and play for easily tightening the AN fittings. It's a lot easier to just tighten the turbo to the manifold at the very end. Lastly, we'll reconnect the right-hand turbocharger's wastegate connector, plug that thing in, and then we'll be able to install the AC compressor and the 3 bolts back into place. Now Corey is reinstalling the starter, getting that all aligned and reconnected. Now that the AC compressor is fully reinstalled, the starter is fully reinstalled, Corey is going up top and he's going to remove the coil packs and the spark plugs to turn the motor over nice and easy, build up oil pressure. This takes a couple times, but you want to keep the throttle pedal at wide open throttle. We unplugged and removed the coil packs and the spark plugs so the engine can't start. But by keeping the throttle pedal at wide open throttle, the computer will not fire any fuel into the cylinder. So full throttle, hit the start button, do not lift that throttle. Wait till the engine stops. Do it again, start button. And just keep pressing the start button, get the motor to turn over until you see the oil pressure come up on the gauge. At that point, we know that the turbos are primed, they're full of oil pressure. We can finish this install. There we go, there's the oil pressure. Now we can finish the install. There's oil in the motor, oil in the turbos, and we're good to go. We came underneath, checked, make sure there's no leaks, and so now we're gonna button up this install. So basically it's slide the intake tube in, connect the air box, connect the charge pipes, and then we'll be able to boost leak test the truck, which we'll do in another video. All right, at this point, the turbo kit is completely installed. The last thing we're gonna do is do a boost leak test. We'll have a separate video on how to boost leak test your truck, so check that out. After that, we fill up the engine with coolant, make sure there's no air bubbles, and then you'll upload your tuner choice. I hope that you can see that this is the kind of job that if you start at 8 a.m. with a friend, you'll be done around 10 p.m. It's a big job, but it's absolutely doable. If you commit to it, you know what you're getting into. I hope this video helps, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comments, and we'll do our best to get back to you. Thank you.